What's happening, fight fans? Ryan Thomas live right here on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast for another post-fight recap. A post-fight recap, the likes of which you've never seen. A fight that you saw two nights ago. That was a fight that the likes of which you've never seen it before. That Jake Paul, Ben Askren fight. I'm going to dive into it here on the show for you today. A lot of takeaways within this Jake Paul Ben Askren bout that took place on ThrillerFightClub.com pay-per-view. You could get it for $49.99. Wow. Where do I start? So let's start off with this. Let's start off with the fact that you can subscribe to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Feel free to leave a review. The reviews matter. The reviews count. I want to start off with that. Plug the show, get the audience in here, let them know where they can find the show and where they can tune into it and where they can enjoy it. Whether they're tuning in on audio on those platforms, podcasting platforms, or Facebook or YouTube, I appreciate the support. So let's get right into it. Jake Paul versus Ben Askren, the recap. Paul KOs Askren in the first round. Now, I going into this fight, I was intrigued by it because this was the first time Jake Paul had actually fought a fighter. Now the keywords there, the first time that Jake Paul had ever fought someone that had fought professionally before. Fuzzy on my head here, it's in the way. First time that Jake Paul had ever fought a fighter before, and Ben Askren was a fighter, not is a fighter currently. He was a fighter. He was a retired mixed martial artist. But for Jake Paul to even check off that box, that was a big box for him to check off. Tip my cap to him for that, for actually stepping into a combat sports forum against a former combat sports athlete. Bear with me here, a former combat sports athlete. So I'm not giving Jake Paul the credit that everybody else seems to be giving him due to the fact that he won this fight against a 37-year-old former mixed martial artist that was never known for his boxing, that was never known for his striking ability in any MMA fight that he had ever fought in, and he decides to box for that $500,000 plus the pay-per-view points that he got. I will say credit where credit is due in the sense that you agree to compete, you sign on the bottom line of a contract, you agree to compete, and you say, hey, I'm going to fight such and such. I'm going to try to knock this guy out. Whatever happens, happens. But I'm going to try to knock this guy out. Jake Paul did achieve that. As ridiculous as that fight was, Jake Paul did achieve that. So I tip my cap to him for that. But it took me about a day and a half. I mean, we're 2 days removed from the fight. It took me a little while to actually digest the events that took place on Saturday night. In terms of the event in and of itself, the event was terrible. The entertainment in between the fights, it was mind-numbingly bad. The Justin Bieber performances, the Mount Westmore performances, I'm not a fan of that. I'm a purist when it comes to fighting. I want to see the fights. I'm not there to see this, entertainment act, this variety show that was Triller Fight Club. Yes, it's different. It offers some different things, but I wasn't exactly, excited or shall I say entertained with the fight, with the card and the format, I guess you could say, of the card itself. I thought that was a little frustrating and, to be honest, a little bit annoying in the sense that I just wanted to see, Paul and Askren do battle, and it felt like the fight itself took such a long time for it to actually come to fruition, given all of the concerts and all the entertainment acts, if you will, that were on the show, that were part of the show, this variety show, I guess you could say. And worse than that, I mean, when you look at the whole difference in perspective of how they brought about the entertainment aspect of it, you can kind of say, okay, The man in charge is Snoop Dogg. He's going to bring a little bit of flair, a little bit of a new element. So you kind of can just, say, well, it is what it is. It comes with the territory of this event. Whereas the commentating was the worst commentating that I had ever heard in all my years of watching fights, whether it be boxing or mixed martial arts. The commentating in and of itself, particularly with former boxing legend, great, I guess you could say boxing legend and boxing great, Oscar De La Hoya, the way he commentated those fights was, for lack of a better term, disturbing. He was saying baby practically every other word. He was definitely not a man of a sober mind, I guess you could say. And it was embarrassing. It was an embarrassing event, and it was almost made to be embarrassing from the jump. I mean, it was purposely embarrassing. They went out of their way to make it as against the grain as against the cloth of boxing as you possibly could. And there's a fine line in that. There's a fine line in that, in the sense that, yeah, they want to offer a difference in entertainment, but the other side of it is you're starting to disrespect the sport. You're starting to disrespect where the sport was to where it is now. It's night and day. And that was my biggest takeaway of the night, regardless of who won between Jake Paul and Ben Askren. That the biggest takeaway was not only was the fight bad, but the event was bad for combat sports as a whole. And that's sad. It's sad that, you look at some of the biggest fights in the history of boxing, Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti, obviously Ali and Frazier, Foreman, and all those guys, Marvin Hagler, the late great Marvin Hagler, the Fab Four of that time, where you had Hagler, Duran, Leonard, and Hearns, Tommy the Hitman Hearns. I mean, what a stark contrast in the state of boxing then to now. I mean, if anyone hit the nail on the head, it was Pete Davidson in the lead up to the fight, that, hey, we're here for this Jake Paul Ben Askren fight. I think this fight actually shows how far boxing has actually fallen. And I couldn't agree more with him. I mean, not only was the fight embarrassing and how Ben Askren represented himself in the ring, but the event, the way the event was broadcast and displayed to a live audience, I thought was really ridiculous. If you had kids that were watching that, I mean, there were some cringeworthy moments with a lot of, R-rated, X-rated entertainment that is just not for me. I mean, I'm watching it as a, sports fan, as a boxing fan, and it left a lot to be desired in that regard. That there weren't many moments of real boxing, but there were moments that we could hang our hat on as fight fans and be impressed by, and I'll get to those. But first, I want to just acknowledge the MMA side of the coin. You're going to have boxing fans, diehard boxing fans, throw insults towards MMA now in regards to how Ben Askren fought or didn't fight, I guess you could say, in his bout with Jake Paul. And it's so misguided and so misleading, and it's so uneducated in terms of Ben Askren and his fighting capability as a boxer. I mean, I wasn't going in there thinking that Ben Askren was going to knock out Jake Paul. I wasn't going in there thinking that Jake Paul was going to knock out Ben Askren. I was going in there thinking that, Ben Askren and Jake Paul were going to fight a very boring 6-round decision that Ben Askren would probably win. That was before the weigh-in. That was before I saw Ben Askren show up, this frumpy, pudgy snowman shell of himself that he showed up as during the weigh-in. When I saw the picture of the weigh-in, I thought, this is not good. This is not good. Ben Askren looked like a grandfather, that sat on the couch for, 6 months and ate a bag of potato chips every day. I mean, it was really bad how Ben Askren looked in terms of his physical prowess, or lack thereof, I guess you could say. He looked very bad physically. And I thought, man, I really hoped at that moment when I saw Ben Askren during the weigh-in, I had hoped that Ben Askren wasn't just taking on this fight for the sake of the payday, that Ben Askren was actually taking this fight seriously. And unfortunately, he didn't. I can't say with a straight face that Ben Askren took this fight more seriously than Jake Paul did. So in that regard, I think Jake Paul did take this fight seriously, whereas Ben Askren, I can't say he did. And the great George St. Pierre on Joe Rogan's show, Joe Rogan Experience, of course, went on to say that he had hoped that, Ben was taking this fight seriously due to the fact that he'd only trained with Freddie Roach for 1 week. You got 12 weeks of training camp, and you only train with Freddie Roach for 1 week. 1 week. You have the best boxing coach in the world. You only train with him for 1 week. That's not good. I know Ben Askren probably didn't make the money that he should have in his mixed martial arts career, but at the same time, you're fighting for the MMA community, whether you want to admit it or not. You're fighting for the namesake that you have as one of the better NCAA wrestlers that this country has ever produced. And you're fighting for your pride overall. Your pride matters, right? It should. Apparently it didn't. None of those things mattered. He went on to say that Ben Askren went on to say that he wasn't fighting for the MMA community. And if Ben Askren went into this fight with Jake Paul thinking that he wasn't fighting for the MMA community, I mean, he shouldn't have fought the fight. If that's what he realistically thought going in there with Jake Paul, he should have never got in there, because he was fighting for the MMA community in the sense that he's a former mixed martial artist. You wanted to prove your worth and show that MMA fighters have the capable striking. And Ben Askren, of all fighters in mixed martial arts history that have had success, out of all of them, the worst striker among all divisions is Ben Askren. I could have told you that prior to Jake Paul knocking him out. I'm telling you after Jake Paul knocked out Ben Askren. I can't necessarily say that Jake Paul was impressive. I can say, though, that Ben Askren should be embarrassed with his performance. Should be very embarrassed by the performance that he had. And I'm embarrassed for mixed martial arts fighters that have the capable striking to step into a boxing ring, like Frank Mir, who fought Steve Cunningham earlier in the event, that showed that he had capable striking and showed that he could go round for round for round with Steve Cunningham, a former world champion in the sport of boxing. And you show up fat, out of shape, overweight, pudgy, and you're taking on a guy that I don't know, coming off of that fight, anyone with a sound mind, I don't know how anyone with a sound mind can watch that fight with Jake Paul and come away thinking that Jake Paul is a great boxer after that fight. Like, wow, Jake Paul's a phenomenal boxer. He put on a clinic and he showed that he's got great boxing ability. I think anyone that thinks that is out of their damn mind. And I'm not taking anything away from Jake Paul in saying that, but what I am saying is that Jake Paul is not a boxer still. We're talking about a guy that has stepped into a boxing ring 3 times to box fighters that are not boxers. So how is he a boxer if he's succeeding against boxers, quote unquote boxers, that are not boxers? How does that make Jake Paul a boxer? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. So, and I say that, and I say still, because the questions that we had about Jake Paul still have not been answered. So whether Jake Paul knocked out Ben Askren in the first round or whether Jake Paul lost to Ben Askren on Saturday night, we'd still have the same questions. That Jake Paul is not a boxer until he fights and beats a boxer. Nate Robinson, not a boxer. Ben Askren, not a boxer. The first guy he fought, I don't even know what the guy's name is off the top of my head. He's not a boxer either. So outside of marks, casuals, Jake Paul is not a boxer. And I had a discussion with a buddy of mine, and we were talking about how he mentioned how Jake Paul has sparred with, better fighters in the training camp, and Sparring is not fighting. Sparring is practice fighting, where you're bringing in sparring partners to help you get different looks and learn and see how you throw your punches on him and see how he throws his punches on you. That's sparring. It's like preseason football in comparison to real football. You're just going through the motions. Yeah, the sparring sessions get a little bit heated, and they can go from 0 to 100 or a 5 to 100, 5 to 10 or whatever, however you want to phrase it real quick. It can definitely change like that. But to say that, Jake Paul is this guy that, we should all take seriously, he's on the come up, it is an insult to boxers that share even the same record as Jake Paul, that have actually boxed boxers to achieve that record. Whereas Jake Paul has not boxed boxers to achieve a 3-0 record. 3-0 for Jake Paul is meaningless in the fashion and form in which he got to 3-0. It is meaningless. You put Ben Askren and Jake Paul in an alleyway, and Ben Askren finishes that scuffle in 2-3 minutes at most. Wouldn't take long. I say that for any boxer versus MMA fighter. Any boxer that steps into a UFC octagon will not do well. Any mixed martial artist outside of Conor McGregor that steps into a boxing ring won't do well. And I say outside of Conor McGregor because boxing fans, diehard boxing fans, they think that, Conor fought like crap. He did really, really bad in that fight with Floyd Mayweather. He went 10 rounds with Floyd Mayweather. Ben Askren didn't last 2 minutes with Jake Paul. If anything, Ben Askren's terrible performance against Jake Paul took away some of the shine that mixed martial artists received, in particular Conor McGregor, for his performance against Floyd Mayweather. I think Ben Askren embarrassed not only himself, but mixed martial arts, as well as NCAA wrestling. And I'm not saying I was the greatest wrestler ever. I wasn't. But knowing that community between high school, NCAA, the Olympic level, that is a massive, massive community. It's a massive sport. And Ben Askren was one of the best guys to ever do it, to put on a singlet, to take on a NCAA, to, step foot onto an NCAA mat, and to fight Jake Paul in that fashion, in that physical condition. It was embarrassing. It was sad. And what's even more sad about it is, he didn't really seem to care. And that's even more frustrating. And in this whole thing, people will listen to this show and they'll say, well, Ryan, you're not really giving credit to Jake Paul. How can I give somebody credit for doing something in a forum against someone who has never competed in that forum? It's really tough to give someone that shine, that credit, when they still haven't done it in the most legitimate of ways that you could do it. Ben Askren was a wrestler. He wrestled hundreds of matches. He won a lot of them against wrestlers. Jake Paul is 3-0 in boxing matches against people that aren't boxers. So it's just, to me, I'm very curious to see what happens next with him. I will say that they have been able to master the art of getting attention and accumulating attention for him. He's built up his name. He's built up his career. He's done a real good job at that, and I give him credit for that. If you want to call it a career or a boxing career, man, I've watched boxing since I was a little kid. I've watched some of the best fight the best. And to say that Jake Paul is a decent boxer, you watch those fights. You watch even, James Toney, fights, or, I'm talking weight class wise, not talent wise. I'm talking just weight class. Even a big heavyweight against a big heavyweight, you see boxing acumen, you see boxing talent, you see athleticism. I didn't see that in the slightest in Jake Paul's performance versus Ben Askren. He threw a couple rights to the body, a couple rights to the head, overhand right to the head that missed twice, and then he threw it again and it landed. That to me showed how terrible Ben Askren is as a striker, and it showed how much of a novice Jake Paul is as a striker. So, Tommy Fury, Tyson Fury's brother, has shown some interest in fighting Jake Paul. I'd like to see that. I think that that's something that would be fun. But let's be honest. I mean, this is an embarrassment to combat sports. It's an embarrassment to boxing. It's an embarrassment to the whole just industry. And I mean, it shows how desperate boxing is when you have to pluck someone from YouTube to generate views and buys. And wow, really, really sad. So the fact that this man has competed in the same ring as Mike Tyson, the fact that Jake Paul has competed in the same ring as number 2 and number 3 junior welterweights in the world who fought on that card the other night. Wow, it's just sad. So, I mean, that's my take on it. Ben Askren, I really think he I don't want to say he destroyed his fighting name, but he definitely didn't help it. I mean, I don't know how you can look at Ben Askren and look at him the same way as you did before. And that's coming off of the Jorge Masvidal knockout, coming off of the Damian Maia submission loss, to fighting Jake Paul and being knocked down in the first round. It was just downright sad. And I think Ben Askren needs to go away. I'm at that point, and I hate to say it because I'm a fan of Ben. I've watched Ben Askren for probably 5-10 years, whether it's mixed martial arts and reading his we're watching bits and pieces of his NCAA wrestling career. It's very disheartening, the performance that he put out, and I think that this event was a joke. The fact that Oscar de la Hoya is even coming back, that's an even bigger joke. And I think these train wreck type fights between these old shot fighters, in certain aspects, it's a good thing. I was a big proponent and a big fan of Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. Those two guys are real fighters. Those two guys are real boxers. They have something left to give. Who didn't want to see Mike Tyson compete again? Who didn't want to see Roy Jones Jr. compete again? Oscar de la Hoya? No. We know why he's doing it. It's safe to, put 1 and 1 together. 1 + 1 equals 2 on that one. And that's, 2 + 2 = 4 on that one, I guess you could say too. It's very easy to figure out why Oscar de la Hoya is stepping into a boxing ring again. And I'm just going to leave it at that. But the fact that you have these older fighters trying to, get their name back off of Triller as a co-main to Jake Paul and Ben Askren, or on the same card as a Jake Paul or a Logan Paul, I just think that it's sad. So that's my take on it. A lot of people will disagree with me. There's some people that like this freak show stuff. And there's times where I like it too. I mean, I wanted Mike Tyson to come back, but Mike Tyson is one of the best heavyweights to ever live, to ever put on a pair of boxing gloves. This Jake Paul thing is such a fad that'll be over before we know it. I don't expect Jake Paul to be a topic of conversation, a year or two from now. I really don't. He'll get put in there against a real boxer, and it won't be good. And all the people right now that are saying, oh, this guy's a great boxer, he's so great, you're going to end up looking like you don't know much about combat sports. And that's the case for sure. If you watch that fight and you come away thinking that Jake Paul is a good boxer, you got to watch some real boxers. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, my post-fight recap to Jake Paul's first round TKO against Ben Askren. Tune in for more episodes of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, and Facebook. Plenty of NFL draft coverage coming up. We're 10 days away from the National Football League's draft, and I got my first round mock out. If you haven't checked that out, you can check it out on all the platforms that you find your podcasts. As I said, Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, Facebook. Check it out. find out who I have the Bills taking at the 30th overall selection in the 2021 NFL Draft. Take care, everybody.